Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 2, Conflicts and Challenges in Canada, 1800 to 1850. This is Lesson Number 22, What Caused Unrest in Upper and Lower Canada? Let's begin by considering the following. Can you think of a time when Canadians used violence to express their frustration with their government? Is it usual or unusual for Canadians to hold riots and violent protests to demand change? So I'll put the video on pause so that you can consider your response and then write down your response on a separate piece of paper. You might want to speak with your parents or older relatives at home, and they can share their perspective on how in the past Canadians have taken action to show that they want change. And let's proceed. In the 1830s, tensions were rising in the Canadas between those who had power and those who wanted it. In 1837 and 1838, the political unrest in Upper and Lower Canada exploded into short-lived yet violent rebellions. Rebellions are acts of open resistance to established governments or rulers. Today's lesson will look at the factors which caused these uprisings, and yes, we will, in our last couple of lessons for grade 7 history, take a look at what actually happened during these rebellions. After the War of 1812, much of the best unfarmed land was given to wealthy British immigrants or set aside for the clergy. As a result, many Canadian and Loyalist farmers were forced to farm on land with poor soil. Since they were unable to grow an adequate number of crops, many families were experiencing poverty, and some were close to starvation. Many Canadian farmers had to leave the farm in search of factory work in the cities. In both Canadas, many poor people felt that the rich were ignoring their suffering. At the same time, a growing middle class of professionals, in other words, doctors, lawyers, journalists, were making more money and wanted to have more power and influence. However, the political structure of the time kept these people from earning positions of power. The Governor General of each Canada was chosen by the King or Queen. The Governor General would then appoint or choose wealthy members of society of their respective Canada to be on the executive and legislative councils. These appointments were for life, meaning members of the executive and legislative councils stayed in office until they died or they chose to retire after reaching old age. Voters were able to elect the members of the Legislative Assembly. And just to make it a little more clear, we have this diagram here showing that right at the top of the British government chooses a Governor General. Governor General then appoints people to the Executive Council and the Legislative Council. So these would be your wealthiest people in society, friends of the Governor General as well. So you had two political bodies here. And then it's interesting that we have a complete separation here. We have the general public, and then we have people who had the right to vote, in other words, men who owned land, and they elected members of the Legislative Assembly. But we don't see any connection here between the Executive Council and the Legislative Council. Just to read the fine print here and keep this in mind. The policy-making executive, meaning Executive Council and Legislative Council, gets this power from the Governor General, not the voters. So the Executive and Legislative Councils, they basically could do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to answer to the public. Also important to note that the governor was not connected to the elected assembly. So from this diagram, it looks like there's an unfair balance of power here. But let's continue. The legislative assembly could create and pass laws. However, the executive council could block any laws that the legislative assembly passed. If a law created by the legislative assembly did not suit the interests of the wealthy, the executive council would stop its passage. In turn, the executive council needed the legislative assembly to approve taxes. If the legislative assembly felt the taxes supported only the wealthy, they would refuse to support the passage of these taxes. So it was a back and forth struggle to get any work done in government. In Upper Canada, a group of wealthy men who made up the Executive Council controlled the economy and the government. They were nicknamed the Family Compact by a man named William Lyon Mackenzie, who you see in this painting here. Mackenzie was a newspaper owner who was a member of the Legislative Assembly. He was very unhappy with how the government worked, and he attacked the Family Compact with many accusations in his newspaper. Although he was kicked out of the assembly more than once, voters liked Mackenzie, so they kept re-electing him. So here we have a political cartoon from one of Mackenzie's papers. He's referring to the family compact, showing that the wealthy elites in Upper Canada, good friends with each other, really concerned just with themselves and nobody else. And then an iconic portrait of William Lyon Mackenzie. And question for you here. You'll notice that he's holding documents in his hands. And I'm wondering, why do you think the artist painted Mackenzie holding documents in his hands? Like, why wouldn't the artist just show Mackenzie with his hands crossed over his lap? Something to think about, and we'll talk about it in tomorrow's class. In Lower Canada, a similar group of men controlled the Executive Council. They were nicknamed the Chateau Cleek. The Chateau Cleek was English-speaking and wanted to unite the Canadas so that English speakers would be in the majority. The Canadians were not happy with this. So just take a look at this political cartoon here. Might just want to note difference in size of characters in the background and in the foreground, as well as how the people in the background are all dressed. And my question to you is, what do you think the artist's message is in this illustration? So put the video on pause, get a closer look, jot down what you think based on what you see in this political cartoon. Okay, let's continue. By the 1830s, many people with the government shared Mackenzie's frustration. They came to call themselves reformers, and they were angry that the requests for government reform were ignored by the Governor General and the Executive Council. As tensions grew, the government of each Canada was divided into two groups, the reformers and the conservatives, those who wanted to keep the existing system. The conservatives came to be called the Tories. In fact, you might even hear that name being used today, whether it be in newspapers or on TV or in the radio. It all comes back to this time. Reformers in Lower Canada organized into the Parti Patriots. Their leader was a man named Louis-Joseph Papineau. The Patriots believed that French speakers should be in control of the government of Lower Canada. They wrote a document called the 92 Resolutions and sent it to Britain. The British government did not accept any of the demands that were included in the document. All reformers in both Canadas wanted responsible government. With responsible government, the main decision makers would be elected, not appointed. However, the reformers disagreed on how to achieve responsible government. Reformers like Egerton Ryerson and Robert Baldwin wanted to work on a compromise solution with the Executive Council. Mackenzie and Papineau, however, did not want to compromise. If necessary, they were willing to bring about change through violent means. That ends the story for now, folks, but let's finish off this video by considering the following. 1. How do you think the growing political tension affected the relationships between the Canadians, the British supporters, and the new immigrants? And number 2, what do you think would be positive and negative consequences of becoming a reformer like Mackenzie or Papineau? So as always, you're going to put the video on pause so that you can write down your responses to these two questions. If you don't feel confident in your ability to answer these questions, it means you need to go back, watch this video at least a couple of more times. Then when you feel more confident, put the video on pause. And I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these two questions, as well as the questions put forth earlier in this video. But until tomorrow's class, this concludes today's video.